Young, emerging, aspiring, whatever word you identify with, these camp professionals want to get involved and stay involved in the camp industry. Listen in today as Cassie and I discuss the ins and outs of identifying as one of these camp professionals. Hear about what we had when we started out, what opportunities we wished we had, and how we feel the industry could better support young emerging camp pros. This isn't an episode you're going to want to miss. Welcome to Beyond Camp, where we explore the intersection of camp in our lives. For too long, camp professionals have referred to camp as being in a bubble, and we are here to burst that bubble. We know that camp interacts with every aspect of our lives, and we're excited to delve into those. We are your hosts, Rachel Kent. My pronouns are she, her,
And I'm Cassie Bloy. My pronouns are also she, her.
and we're here to go beyond camp with you. As a friendly reminder, please subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening today, and be sure to check out the show notes at gocamp.pro/beyondcamp. Now, let's get started. Today, we're here to talk to you about being a young or emerging camp professional. And I'm going to separate those two out for a second here because being a young or emerging camp professional has nothing to do with how old you are, but perhaps instead with how long you've been in the industry for, whether or not you're able to work full time yet, and your experience with camping as a whole. So when we say young professional, we're referring perhaps in age, but also perhaps in experience and the stage in which your career is in. And we're excited to delve into this topic. We're going to cover a bunch of different areas from our experiences to our hopes and dreams for the camping industry, where we think it's fallen short, and what we are hopeful for the future. Uh, so, Cassie, I'll turn it over to you. What
hmm
does being a young camp pro mean to you?
Yeah, I was really thinking a lot about this. And as you were describing and introing it, I was like, that's exactly what I was thinking of. It's like, it's more than just being chronologically young, it's more than just having a desire to do this. But it can be those things as well. And how people might identify within that will look different for each person as well. So for me, it was kind of more of that having a desire to enter or to continue working in the world of camping, but more or less people who have done it year round in some capacity or worked multiple contracts year in and year out in different roles, but have, you know, 3 to 6 years of full time year round experience.
I think of it as like mid-level management as
Oh,
well.
yeah.
So like folks who are taking that first step into like full-time management. So it could be like you're young in age, like I said, but also just
hmm
like that stage of career, like you're just getting into that. You've had a couple of years where you're able to like make some decisions now, maybe a few more decisions than you used to make, but you don't have like full signing authority, let's say, depending on the structure of your organization. So for me, I identify pretty strongly with the idea of being a young camp pro because I'm under the age of 30 and I've had less than 5 years of full time work experience in camping. So I've done the seasonal thing, which I loved and holds a special place in my heart for sure. Fall outdoor ed was my favorite season to work by far. Um, but yeah, so I identify because my career is still like finding its trajectory and finding its path. And I think that's a lot when I think of like the emerging camp pros, like we're still defining our path. And I mean, our careers are going to look different than a lot of the folks that came before us because even just like in society, people don't have the same
hmm
careers for 20, 30, 40 years anymore. Um, but some folks do. My partner's a teacher. Hopefully, she'll have a long career in that field. But lots of us are going to switch paths and switch
Yeah.
careers. But yeah, when I think of an emerging camp pro, I think of that finding that path that they're on.
Yeah. And I think that's so important that as a person, you get to choose that path and which way you take it. And whether that's working lots of seasonal positions and enjoying kind of that almost camp year round camp pro one solid position all the time, or going into a full time year round position, that is up to you and how you want to make your career happen. And both of them are completely valid and available.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes you have to start down that path before you can even know where the options are. Like,
hmm
when you think about when you head into the forest on a hike, I love a good metaphor. You're head into the forest, you have no idea what the options are going to be for your path until you get to that fork, that proverbial fork in the road, and get to be like, okay, I'm going to go left or right here. Like, you don't even know what the options are until you start. So I imagine sort of a young or emerging camp pro to be somebody who's sort of stepped into the forest and is on their way, has maybe made a decision or two, but not somebody who has the entire map of the forest in front of them.
I really like that analogy slash metaphor.
Yeah, maybe it's actually an analogy. I'll look up those definitions later. So, in general, though, I think it's important we talk about this. I mean, we've talked about being millennials. We
Yeah.
know that that's something we both feel passionately about for a variety of reasons. But I think it's important that we talk about sort of like young and emerging camp pros so that we are able to welcome people and create an understanding that there's a place in camping for folks who are in this stage of their careers.
Yeah, and as you say that, I'm like, it's so important for camp professionals who are in this and maybe aren't fitting into that young and emerging space to know that it's important to do this now more than ever, where our industry is at today,
Hmm.
with so much unknown, that people need to know that, even if they have to step away for a bit, that the industry still exists and we're here to support each other.
Yeah, because I have a fear, and I've said this to some folks before, I have a fear that we're going to lose a whole generation of directors. And I say
Hmm.
that for a few reasons. And one of them is that middle management, so kind of similar to like positions you and I had,
Yeah.
and lots of other folks our age and like career stage have, were the first jobs to be cut in all of this.
Hmm.
Aside from like contract workers and seasonal staff, like these were jobs that had to go, which is fair during a pandemic. Like organizations have to stay afloat, and it's not at all a criticism of that. But my concern is that folks have lost their jobs. They've gone off to other things. And are they going to come back to camping? What's going
Yeah.
to be that draw that brings them back? Like, yes, you're passionate about it, but now camp folks have experienced, perhaps for the first time, sort of like an adult summer, like a summer where you're not at camp, and doing things. And of course, it wasn't a
Hmm.
summer as we would have expected, but you got to do some of those things, and maybe they found another job that's like provides a little bit more stability or work-life balance and things like that. And so I'm really worried that there's going to be a whole bunch of folks who've left camping and just don't feel pulled back or just find what seems to be an easier lifestyle outside of camping. um, and I really, that concerns me a lot.
And it's so true and so valid to have that concern, because sometimes I feel that way. Like that, hey, I've found this job outside of camp, and it's, I can go home at the end of the day and I don't have to think about my job. I
Hmm.
can I can go home at the end of the day
Hmm.
at an hour that's respectable and have dinner at home. It's finding a better balance, and it's kind of nice, but maybe that's because we're doing something wrong in camping. It's hard. I know that's hard to hear.
No, but I think that's really true. And I think we are going to dive into that a little bit later of like what do new and emerging camp pros like need from the industry, and I think that that's going to
Oh
be a really
yes.
important tie-in. One other thing that popped into my mind that I wanted to touch on is that I think it's important we talk about young camp pros because young camp pros need space to be created for them by others, and
Hmm.
so they need space for somebody to look around a table and be like, oh, we don't have this perspective and we want it at the table. I think that's really important. That's why we need to talk about it so people know that even if emerging camp pros aren't actively involved in camping right now, or if the majority of them have had to wander away, that like, hey, there's still folks who are here and want to have a voice.
And that's so important. And I think a lot of our young and aspiring camp pros, or emerging camp pros as well, are in that same generation as us. I'm millennials, and we want to make changes. We want to right our wrongs. And we, see some of these bigger societal shifts that are coming and are in progress.
Hmm.
We want to help make that change. And it's those voices and those thought processes that need to have a seat at the table.
Totally, because I think, somebody said to me once, I don't remember who it was, but I was talking about being um worried about being a young person at a board table because I am one of the younger people on the board that I sit on, and so I was sharing that like I'm the youngest or one of the younger people,
Mm.
and they said, yeah, but you have such a unique perspective that other people don't have because you're like one of the only people in that age category, and it really like kind of shifted my like mindset towards that. And I was like, oh, that's really true. Is that when we invite folks from different stages of life to sit at the table with us to join in discussion, we are gifted with a variety of perspectives on a topic. And I think that when we're in a time like this, you know, a pandemic, we need to think outside the box. We need to get creative by having different perspectives at the table with people who are willing to look and think differently. Um, For example, like millennials are their techno- technology literacy rate is
Hmm.
typically super high. What a fantastic perspective to have at a table. Like maybe they know folks who've developed apps, maybe they developed apps themselves. I say that because one day during pre-camp a year or two ago, I was just like chatting with some staff one evening and they were like, "Oh yeah, we're developing these apps." And I was like, "Oh, okay." Just like in their spare time, they were doing some coding and computer programming. Anyways, I digress. But I think that that perspective and perhaps a different way of looking at problems and a different way of approaching the world could be really helpful.
Yeah, well, and it also, as you like talk about it, it also helps me wonder, these people around the table and having different generations and different backgrounds and histories, how can we gain mentorship from that as well and learn from other people's experiences?
Hmm. Yeah, and don't get me wrong. I think there's an incredible importance, and I want to be very clear on this, that I'm not saying that young or emerging aspiring camp pros know better than everybody else, because that's not what I'm saying. And I think that that's very dangerous. I think there's a responsibility of young and emerging camp pros to have a sense of humility and want to learn from those who've come before us, from both their incredible successes and their mistakes. Camp pros are often very willing to share both. And I appreciate that a lot. And I think it's important. We need to understand that folks who've been doing this for perhaps as long as we've been alive, maybe longer, in the Ontario Campus Association, we have honorary life members. You know, these folks have so much to share. And
Mhm.
it's important that we understand where the industry has come from because that will help show us where we're going in the future. It doesn't mean that we have to go down the same path, but it allows us to see um, maybe the mistakes we've made, the fumbles. It also provides us with the context for change we're trying to make. And I think that's really important when we think about humility is understanding the context in which we are um, trying to create change. And context is one of my top 10 from Gallup Strength Finder. So that's why I like to know it. But once you have an understanding of what's happened, then you're like more culturally aware and culturally sensitive to what's going on in the industry and your organizations to try and shift the tide if you need to, or adjust the direction of the cruise ship you're sailing.
Yeah, definitely. It just has so much more for us out there than we actually realize, that we can rely on, that we can count on, that we can ask for support from as
Hmm.
well. Like when we're, I know for me personally, as a young camp pro, I was kind of on my own and kind of had to go through those struggles by myself. And we'll talk, I think I have it scheduled for a little bit later in this conversation, but like the value of mentorship is so important to helping young camp pros learn and
Yeah,
to adjust.
and camp is such a beautiful place for that, and the camping community is as well. Like, there's so many people out there who I've had, remarkable conversations with who want to share things with me. Um, and as a young camp pro, I think it's my responsibility to sit and to listen. And so much of camping is passed down through oral tradition and oral history. Um, and it's important that we don't lose those things as well. Um, and I think that there's like some really neat and new and creative ways that we can connect with that. And I'm grateful for folks who create space for those conversations to happen. Alrighty, we're going to take a quick pause here and we will be right back after this. Inequitable access to professional development doesn't only impact the camp pro trying to increase their knowledge, but ultimately the children and adults they serve. This is why ACA Illinois is committed to providing free to low cost professional development programs each year, because every child deserves to attend a camp where the director has had the very best training, no matter the camp's financial situation.
We know that camp pros always want better for themselves, their camps, their staff, and ultimately their campers. That's why we are so grateful to ACA Illinois for ensuring training and professional development resources that are affordable and accessible for all camp pros.
During the pandemic, ACA Illinois has been a fantastic resource for professional development for many camp pros during what has been a challenging time for many of us. As we've both shared, we've spent some of this time furloughed or laid off and are grateful to have still been able to access trainings and resources at an affordable rate as we stay connected to the camp industry.
As the pandemic continues and financial struggles continue, ACA Illinois is committed to ensuring that financial barriers don't hinder access to trainings for staff. They recognize that this year has presented new financial barriers and don't want those to get in the way of training or professional development. After all, They want your campers to have the best camp experience possible. And we all know that well trained staff deliver better camp programs. Elevate your camp and your career at acail.org. All right, so we are going to dive back in here talking about being emerging or young or aspiring camp pros, however you want to think about it. But we want to start by thinking about and talking about some tips for advancing your career and creating that name for yourself, because knowing who you are within camping is so important. So when I was thinking about this, it was really about getting outside of my comfort zone for me that allowed me to progress and to get involved with more than just your camp. And I
Mhm.
think that's just so much more important than to be actively involved not only in your camp, but in the camping industry as a whole. You can join boards, you can join committees, mastermind groups. There's so much out there that you can do.
Mhm. Yeah, I feel really, really strongly about that. When I think about this, I think about the idea of just of being the person who says yes. And I will say yes, you need to set your boundaries for things, but to be the person who's sort of known as the person who will like dive into new things and try new things and take on new projects. So when somebody says,
Mhm.
"Hey, I need someone to help with this," saying yes, like I would love to help with that. It's how I got involved with the Camp Pro Slack group. The COVID-19 Slack group was Travis was like, "We need some people to help," and I was like, "Sure, yeah, I'm here." I had no idea how to use Slack. I do now, but I said yes, and that was incredible and connected with me with so many camp pros who I like never would have had conversations with before, who I just would have seen places and be like, "Oh yeah, that's so and so." Now I'm like, "Oh yeah, that's my pal."
Yeah.
Um, those connections are really neat. I mean, that's how really like Cassie and I got connected, and then through
Mhm.
Travis. So I think the idea of like saying yes and putting up your hands for things is really important. And the same goes for getting involved in your camping association, whether it be your state, your area, your province. Wherever it is, I can't speak highly enough of that. Cassie and I both sit on our provincial camping association
Mhm.
boards, and that work has been really important to us. And um, I think I signed up at the end of my very first conference. You did a survey, as you do at conferences, and at the bottom there was like a little box, and you could check here if you wanted to get more involved. And I was like, all right, I'll check here. Um, and here we are, a few years later, several committees later. But it's been great. It's been such a great way to get to know people. Um, and also to learn new skills, like learning how to lead a committee if that's not something you've done before, learning to work with people from different camps, um, learning public speaking skills, whatever it might be. There's a whole world out there that you can get connected with that way.
Yeah, I know I led a committee, and one of the things I did on that committee was start cold calling all of our members just to get to know them.
Wow.
To ask a few questions to see how they were doing and all that. And, cold calling, those first few, scared out of my mind. Just like, this is weird. But, they were so valuable. And we learned so much and connected with so much of our membership just from doing that alone. That
Hmm.
the time I put into it was very worthwhile. And discovering, what people were struggling with at their camp so that we could better support them as an association.
Yeah, just making those connections. This spring, I hosted these like coffee hours where folks would show up and I'd have a bunch of like random icebreaker questions and we would just like chit chat about whatever. It was a really neat way just to get to know some people. And there was like a wide variety of folks showed up to them of different parts of the camping community. Um, and it was lots of fun. And then, people start to get to know you. And I think that's important. And it's not that it's a popularity contest at all. But I think if you want to build your career, you have to have some intentionality behind it. Um, to a degree, perhaps things will happen once you start talking to people, but I also think it's great that for people to know that you're looking for opportunities. Or we're going to drop a mini pod on the importance of working at different camps because Cassie and I both feel strongly about that. So I won't dive too much into that topic. Um, but I also love what you said, Cassie, about doing things that scare you. And I think about walking into some of my first committee meetings and I didn't know anybody else in the room. And it's camp, so there were folks who were super welcoming. But I was like driving to my first meeting and I was like, what have I gotten myself into? And sometimes you just got to do it.
Yeah. First off, I love that you had in-person committee meetings
Back in
like
the day.
back in the day, but even like I ran a committee. We didn't have in person. Everything we did was virtual. So it's so interesting. And that's probably just because we were like all across the province and not
Hmm.
kind of centered in one area. But yeah, it's like we did everything virtually. And I was actually thinking about this today. I was like, won't it be interesting when there isn't a screen in front of me
You mean
having
when
a
you and I could meet in person?
yeah,
Uh, oh, that would be neat.
that would be neat, but it'll be weird because we're so used to having like this screen.
That's true. Um,
We're getting off topic though.
we are, but it also makes me think of. I think you talked a little bit about like speaking engagements and like speaking,
Yeah.
presenting and things. And I know that was something like you and I both had on our bucket list of things to
Hmm.
do. And then this year happened, but we got into it virtually. And this is actually like such a great year to get into conference speaking because we don't have to
Oh
pay to
yeah.
fly anywhere. We just get to sit in the same room that we sit all the time, and present. But it's such a wonderful way to get to try things. It's terrifying because it's different and like, are people on your Zoom call like actually at the conference, or are they off like doing their dishes and you're just like talking to their cat? You don't know, but you got to risk it. And it can be really fantastic and a great experience. So I'm grateful that we've had those opportunities. And I think, again, it's a great way to sort of get experience and put ourselves out there.
Yeah, it was interesting. I know there was like as we were speaking last week and it was kind of like, oh, that person doesn't have a screen on. I don't know. Maybe they don't have a camera. Are they listening? What are they doing? Like you can't get the same visual cues that you would off of a room.
No, but also super cool because I was able to sit here in Toronto and speak to people all over Western Canada.
Yeah.
So I think that's really neat. And I think that's one of the things that's going to be really neat for like young and emerging camp pros moving forward is the
Hmm.
ability to engage with people like across the world. Um, I just like you and I are in different time zones and we've
Yeah.
had this connection. And we're going to be presenting at WIX, the Women in Camp Summit, with folks from around the world. So there's huge potential there as well.
Yeah. So exciting. And like I don't know if I would have done this without that ability to say yes.
Hmm. Yeah, because once you start, the momentum just keeps going. For our friends who get a lot of snow in the winter, it's like that snowball, right? Like you started a little bit small and it kind of crumbles and falls apart a little bit. If you're familiar with snow, you know what I'm talking about when snow's like a little bit too dry and it just like falls apart into your hands. But the more effort you put into it, the more you pack it, and forms into a snowball, and then you can get it rolling and down the hill you go, and your momentum can take off. So I really suggest folks try and be a little bit intentional, not too rigid with your guidelines because the world is going to throw things at you that you never expected, aka the great pandemic of 2020. um, and but put some thought into it and then ask for support. Reach out to people around you who are willing to help you carry that momentum.
Yeah, I would also add like advocate for yourself a little bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have the power to make these decisions and things happen. You just need to figure out what that's going to look like for you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not easy. I know for me, I worked for a really small local private nonprofit. We didn't have the funds for me to do a lot, so I had to find grants. I had to save some of my personal funds. I had to find a way to make the budget work for all of these things, to make the requests and to put proposals together as to why these were so important to me and how they also had value to the camp as a whole.
Mm-hmm. And ask for scholarships. Lots of conferences
Yeah.
have scholarships. Like if we're talking about that kind of thing, like just ask, can I volunteer to shave some money off of my attendance at this? Is there something that I can contribute so I can be there? And people will see that and people will really admire that. Maybe there's an organization out there who can sponsor you to go, because you'll be willing to maybe like do some social media posts or something like that. Um, like create that space for yourself to develop there when you're thinking about professional development. Um, Cassie, what are your other thoughts about professional development? Because I know
Oh,
we are both very keen on professional development and have sort of like different strategies for it.
yeah. Read and listen to anything and everything you can, especially if it's free. Will you maybe turn stuff off halfway through? Of course. Is that okay? Yes, because you need to value your time as well. But if you even get one thing from it, it's worth your time.
Hmm.
And that's, more than we can ask for if we learn one thing or we are thinking in a new way or seeing something in a new light.
Hmm.
But the other thing I've always wanted to do and never had the time to do because I've been busy at camp was to visit other camps.
Ooh, yes.
Like I was so stoked to go on accreditation visits this summer.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
then we didn't, we made some policy changes and weren't doing in-person visits. So
Yeah, I will say if you have the chance to do that with your local camping association to visit other camps, I know in Ontario we have like junior visitors. It's such an incredible way to just like see what's out there, and to see other facilities, and maybe you'll just see like, um, I don't know, like how they organize people to get into their dining hall, and you'll be like, this is brilliant. Like it's really neat to get out there.
yeah, just to see, like, even like I visited camps when they're not in operation and just to see how camps are laid out and why things are like, you can ask those more intentional questions of like, hey, why is this building here? It's
Hmm.
why did you choose to put it here? Or has it always been this way? Or how do you deal or manage with this? And you can actually get to build those connections and relationships with other people, in the same region as you,
Hmm.
and establish that network of people, because those network of people will really just keep you moving forward.
Yeah, and honestly, ask for what you want and what you need. Like I've emailed directors who I've only met like a time or two and be like, I know that you have a great policy around this. Can we chat about it? And often they'll say, wow, it's fantastic that you thought to like think about this and to reach out like that. You must be a great director because you've thought about this. And so they want to have those conversations. So just reach out and ask for what you need and set boundaries around that as well. Like if you're looking for guidance, like should you get involved with a certain committee or with a board? Reach out to somebody on it and say, hey, can we have a quick conversation about it? Like, if you're in a place where you can meet in person, can I buy you a coffee? If not, can I have a coffee Zoom date? Like, what a fantastic way to get to know people, and to build some of those like intergenerational connections as well, and connections between different stages, especially in a time when a lot of us are feeling a bit disconnected from life.
Yeah, that's so true. People, I find people in camping are always willing to pick up that phone and to make time.
Hmm. And we would be remiss if we didn't mention the First Class Counselor podcast, as hosted by our one of our fabulous producers, Matt Hansberger. So be sure to check that out. It has some great professional development. Cassie, I know you've used them quite a bit before.
Yeah, I've listened to them all, and it's really based on getting the tools that your frontline staff need, so your counselors and your programmers need. But also from listening to it, I got a lot of stuff that I could use to help train my staff better or to see things in a new light. I actually sent them out before they arrived for our orientation so that staff could listen to them. And honestly, the staff that listened to them did better
Mhm.
and had more tools in their pockets and things to use and ideas.
I'd believe it. So we've talked about like what we think we need for advancing our careers. We've talked about professional development.
Yeah.
But I think a big part of being an emerging camp pro is identifying your shortfalls and sort of figuring out how to work on them, spin them, attack them, leave them behind, build a strong team around you. Like I think having that like a good understanding of yourself is really beneficial with that. And so I feel really strongly about sort of sitting down with yourself and giving yourself a self assessment. And one of the like the most basic ways I think about this is when I first started directing, I was like a seasonal camp director of a small camp. And I am terrible at arts and crafts. Like it stresses me out. Um, I just like I'm terrible at it. Um, but I appreciate the value that it brings to camp. And my supervisor looked at me and was like, "You're just gonna have to hire somebody who's great at arts and crafts." And I was like, right. I didn't need to become an expert at arts and crafts. I wasn't going to lead it. I needed to hire somebody who was great at it and could empower the staff and teach the staff. And that was a great example of like identifying your shortfalls. And that wasn't one that I needed to fix. Like, I don't need to be a great artist, but I need to find the people who could be great artists.
Oh, yeah. I have that. Like, I know that I'm not going to be that camp director who's out there in a crazy costume, like running all the camp wide games, doing all the crazy fun things. Like that's just not in me. I don't have the energy for that anymore. Like, let's be honest. Figure out what works for you. But I knew that I had to hire a couple people that could do that,
Hmm.
especially after my first summer when I had somebody that could do that. And I was like, oh, I need somebody who has that energy. And
Yeah.
after that, I altered how I screened staff and how I interviewed them to look more at their personality and how they interact with people versus what they're good at or what they're not good at.
Yeah, and also like build a strong team around you. Like once you have a good sense of yourself, you instead of trying to be everything, like all things to all people, build that team. So, for example, as we know from this podcast, my organization skills sometimes could use a little bit of work. So, for anybody who's not sure what I'm talking about, Cassie is the person who fills out calendar invites for both of us, regardless of what it's for. If it's a speaking engagement, if it's something that like we aren't even doing together, but she knows I'm attending, I get a calendar invite for it. She has it all planned out, and it's fantastic. So I used to do that in the summer. I would hire people who were great at scheduling because I was great at the like idea and the concept, and they were great at the like finer execution points of it. And then our strengths just complemented each other that way. And I think finding those complementary strengths is just fabulous and allows people to enjoy their jobs more as well.
Yeah, it's amazing how that sometimes even happens naturally through the interview process.
Hmm.
I've always used true colors, but I never, go through the quiz portion and like determining who people are officially until we're in orientation. And most of the time we get there and I find out that my leadership team has all of these, we're all different. We all strongly identify as a different color.
Hmm.
Uh, and it brings sometimes a little bit of conflict,
Hmm.
but it also brings a lot of strengths to it. And it really, being able to identify that and see that. And I've always wanted to figure out how can I adjust so that I make sure I'm getting the skills and strengths I need to complement the team
Hmm.
as well.
There's probably a whole other podcast in there
I think so. I
about
think,
that topic. One more thing I'll say about this is I do think that there's a lot of value though in still working on your shortcomings. I'm
oh,
not saying
always.
that you should just like admit what you're good at, what you're not good at, and then never work out what you're not good at because I don't think that makes a good camp pro. Um, for example, I don't know a ton about budgeting. It's never fallen into sort of like my portfolio of things I need to do, and it just isn't my strong suit. And so when I was moved into a new role within my camp last fall, I said to my manager, I was like, I would like to learn more about budgeting because I know that this is just something that I don't know a lot about. And she was fantastic, and she like set it up so that she could help me walk through the process and learn about that. So sometimes you need to say, hey, this isn't my strong suit, and people who it is their strong suit will help you out with that. So having that self-awareness allows you to sort of experience more growth.
I strongly recommend being very clear with that statement and making sure you address it to the right person. I'm just going to put that out there. I could go down a rabbit hole right now, but it's probably not great for any of us.
Okay. um, I feel like you have similar thoughts about feedback.
Yeah, feedback is so important. And I'm only just kind of realizing it in the last few months of how important feedback can be for people, for yourself. And I realized, and this all came through an interview process of, interviewing for this new position that I have. And they're like, tell us about feedback that you've received. And I sat there, I was like, yeah, um, I didn't. I didn't really have an answer for them. And they thought that was quite interesting. And we had a great discussion about it and how I would like to receive feedback and all of that. And then they connected with my references, and my references validated that they never really gave me feedback. It was more of a, if you don't hear from us, you're doing great.
Hmm.
And I think having that's really what pushed me personally and gave me that motivation to look for ways to improve. I wasn't getting it anywhere directly, wasn't getting anything great, I wasn't getting anything awful either. I just had a personal drive to do better.
Hmm. Yeah, I think you also like you need to make yourself available for feedback. So repeatedly asking for it and saying like, "Hey, I'm looking for feedback." And sometimes I think it looks like saying, "I've noticed these things about myself, and this is what I'm working on." Lets people know that you are open to feedback and that you're looking at yourself critically.
Hmm.
Because giving feedback can be hard if you think it's not going to be well received. And I like to say to people, I'd much rather have the feedback now when the issue is small versus down the road when it's a huge issue and there's nothing that can be done about it. So let's start these conversations now. Can
And
be really helpful.
let's train our people to do that before it's
That
too
too.
late. Let's just lay that out there.
Yes. All right, Cassie, I have a question for you. If
Okay, hit me
there's
with it.
something that you could ask the camp industry to do for young and emerging camp pros, something that you're feeling discouraged with that you want them to help with, what would it be?
Oh my goodness. Help help them. Help us. Help people when they come or look. And I think this is like really, I'm an introvert. I'm quite quiet person. Like you stick me in a room with a bunch of people, probably not going to talk a lot unless there's some great intention behind it. But, for me, I often felt a little discouraged. And that really happened when I was moving camps, when I had kind of outgrown a camp and felt that it was time to move on, or, there just wasn't the right position there any for me because of budget cuts or whatnot. But even when I thought I had a mentor, but they weren't really, there was no like, hey, I'm your mentor, you're my mentee type relationship. I didn't know at the time that you could explicitly ask somebody,
Hmm.
can you be my mentor?
Hmm.
And had I known that, I think things would be a little bit different.
Hmm.
Yet, even though I didn't have like that explicit mentor, there were still people I could pick up the phone and be like, hey, do you have 5 minutes so that I can talk this through? But that it was 5 minutes. There was no intentionality behind it. It was a quick, like, I need help. You're the first person on my contact list.
Hmm.
So I think we could do better at providing that mentorship for our young camp pros.
Yeah, I think absolutely. When I think about this question, I have a few things. But on the note of mentorship is camp pros, if you know an emerging or camp pro in your life, reach out to them and see how they're doing and see how you can help. Say,
Yeah.
is there something I can do for you? Can we have a quick chat? Like, let's have coffee and let's catch up because that's a fabulous way to stay connected, and just to hear about where they are in their career path right now. And just, when I lost my job, I had some camp pros reach out, and it was just so wonderful. It meant a lot to me as a pretty new camp pro to know that folks were thinking of me. And secondly, to emerging camp pros, to folks who've been doing this for a few years, um, people are watching you. The next generation is watching you. You might not think about that because you might be like, no, like I'm like just starting out. I'm only a few years into this, but still a generation behind you. There's those folks who are just making their foray into full time camping, who are still working seasonally, who are watching you and who are like, wow, I want to be just like you. So mentorship exists everywhere. It doesn't have to be in massive age gaps or massive experience gaps. Reach out to those connections to those people who are just trying to get their foot in the door. And my second piece, that I think is really tangible is we need to be aware of the unspoken curriculum. And I know that's been floating around um, the camping world a little bit. But when we have meetings, when we gather places virtually or in person, and we start calling people by nicknames, so we'll be like, "Oh yeah, like JD, blah blah blah," or like back in the day, JD did this, and you're like, "Who is JD?" Like I'm new here, but everybody else knows who JD is, so I like obviously am lost. Um, like let's start explaining and like sharing some context so that we can be welcoming everybody into that space and feeling like they can know what's going on and know sort of like the inside jokes and the camaraderie and have a sense of being part of the community.
I feel that one.
And now I feel like I'm guilty of it sometimes. I'm like, oh yeah, so and so, and then people are like, who are you talking about? I'm like, you don't know, and I'm like, no, you don't know that person, Rachel. You're becoming just like the people who have frustrated you. So keep that in mind that sometimes it's easy to get caught up, but let's make sure that everybody knows everybody in the room and that we know who we're all talking about.
Yeah, it's so important. It does really leave you feeling less than. You're like, oh, well, I don't know that person. So,
And
I
there's
have
no ill
nothing of
intent
value
there.
to add. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, don't get me wrong, there's no ill intent, but we need to, it's one of those things that we can try and be intentional about. It's the same thing that we try and be intentional about at camp, right? It's like we explain to people how the dining hall works because not everybody knows how it works. Same thing. Not everybody knows, um, how your meetings work or certain people. So that's important. I feel like we're almost wrapping up here, Cassie, but I
Yeah.
want to touch on what sort of young and aspiring camp pros want to see from the industry, from our perspective, of course, because um,
Yeah.
we are only two people.
Yeah. So for me, this looks like transparency and honesty.
Hmm.
Honestly, like that's, I don't know if that's just like my personal values and how I lead things as well. I like to be pretty transparent with my staff about like, hey, this is going to be a hard day.
Hmm.
We've got A, B, and C on the plate, or like, hey, I feel like crap today. This is your heads up.
Hmm.
Or like, I share budget details with them of like, this is how much money we have for this project.
Hmm.
Like, if they don't have, if we don't have everything we need, we can't do the job well.
Hmm. For sure. I think young and emerging camp pros need a bit of a work-life balance,
Yeah.
and an understanding that the world is not what it was 30 years ago when other camp pros entered. I had this conversation with a group of folks who were sitting around one night at the OCA conference, probably, and we were chatting, and there was a camp for sale, and we're like, dreaming of all the things we could do, with it or to the
Oh,
property if
yeah.
we could buy it.
As one young camp pro does.
Yeah, for generations people have done this. But the thing is that generations ago, even maybe just one generation ago, that could have been a feasible dream.
Hmm.
It would have been hard for sure. Um, but that's not something that's happening as much now. To folks who are able to buy camps and start their own camps, all the power to you. That's the dream for many people. But just an awareness that the entering the camp world is much different than it used to be. And then I think I also want to see a continued shift in the camp towards being a camp industry that's reflective of the world that we're living in, that's diverse and inclusive, that is willing to own its mistakes and where it has harmed people, and to look to move forwards from that, not by sweeping it under the rug, but by owning it, admitting it, and moving forward.
Yeah. And all, everything's so important. I'm going to add to like livable wages.
Hmm.
We're both going to just sit here for a moment and just shake our heads if you can't see us. Like, we have some strong thoughts about those ones. But there's so much more that needs to be considered. We like, there's these big topics and social issues that we need to cover, but there's also our personal lives that are need to be accounted for as well. Whether
Hmm.
we're living on property, off property, we need the supports in place to be able to be successful.
Hmm.
But it's time to wrap up, I think. There's
Yes.
so much more we could go into, but maybe we'll dive into some of those other topics in some of our mini pods later on. So stay tuned for those. It was a great conversation today talking about young emerging pros and how we see it.
Hmm.
But before we wrap up, every week we like to talk about self care at our recharge station and how we get through in the good times and the difficult times, because we all know that some of us just aren't great at that. Thinking about how you charge up your batteries and what makes you feel inspired. So for me lately, this has looked like physically writing down my goals and kind of tracking them. So I'm also a little bit of like a stationary paper notebook person. So I was at Staples and I found the clearance bin. Life just got in the way. So if you're on video on our YouTube, you can see I have this lovely goal getter tracker sheet now, and it has a spot for 3 goals, 3 habits you're going to achieve, and even a reward. And then it has a little habit tracker at the bottom so you can like actually physically make X's, which I find very rewarding some days. And I've just found it really helpful. I've been using it for about 3 or 4 weeks now to actually like accomplishing some big tasks,
Nice.
even if those tasks is drinking water when you wake up first thing in the morning.
I have a new habit tracker app I've been using that I'm also enjoying, so I'll drop that into the show notes.
Oh, Excellent. I was looking for one, but couldn't find one I liked. So, paper. Burn it in the fire later. It'll feel great. So, we want to thank everyone for joining us beyond camp. We hope that you were able to connect and reflect with us as we journey beyond the property lines and bring camp wherever we may go. We want you to be able to reach out and connect with us. So you can reach myself, Cassie, at cassie.bloy@stefanricard.ca. Rachel?
Folks are always more than welcome to email me at kentar@girlguides.ca.
Excellent. So a last minute reminder to remember to check out our show notes at gocamp.pro/beyondcamp. And a few thank yous to finish us off. To the team at GoCamp Pro for creating space for these conversations. To ACA Illinois for their sponsorship and continued support of this podcast. To Matt and Jotham for making us sound phenomenal every week. And to you, our listeners, for making the time to listen. Beyond Camp is part of the GoCamp Pro podcast network. Check out all our other podcasts at gocamp.pro/podcasts. Go well and safely, friends. We'll see you next time.